I want to start by talking about Afghanistan way back when I was a young man, and then about Syria now, 30 years later. I want to start where Alam mentioned that in April of 1978, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan organized a coup d'etat against the former Dawood Khan, killed him and his immediate family, and seized power in a coup. It was a coup that I think now, 30 years later, we look back, it was a coup that was trying to push Afghanistan in a very progressive direction, toward more broad-spread education, medical equipment, push against the Islamists, who immediately opposed it. And the contest back then, those of you that are old enough to remember, was this progressive socialist regime in Afghanistan against Islamist mujahideen backed by Pakistan and the United States shortly thereafter. Now that coup d'etat in '78, I think, had very little to do with the Soviet Union. Once it occurred, the Soviet Union was asked by the Afghans to help it and come to its defense in the name of modernity and progress in Afghanistan against what was one of the most backward countries on the face of the earth in terms of infant mortality, education of men and women, and any other criteria you want to look at. And that won't surprise any of you because you see where Afghanistan is today. But back then we were in the midst of a Cold War. And that meant that for Pakistan, but more importantly for the United States, this was understood as a communist takeover. And therefore we would support whoever the communists were against, which ended up having us align with Pakistan and arm the mujahideen, as we called them then, the Taliban, as you know them now. Not just similar people, the same people. People like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and others. At the same time, the United States, this is of course spring of 1978, there's a revolution occurring in Iran, right next door. And the revolution gets full force by the end of '78, and the Shah is driven out of the country in February of '79. Right as all this is going on, and the United States is getting introduced to Islamic radicalism for the first time in a big way, and are deeply confused about it all. We're deeply against Islamic revolution in Iran, and by the end of 1979, before the Russians intervene, our hostages are seized. After the Shah left in February, our hostages were taken in November of '79. The Russians invade in December of '79. And so while at the same time the United States is intensely anti-Soviet, arming mujahideen, Islamic radicals in Afghanistan, we're completely opposed to the Islamic revolution in Iran and see Islam as the new threat, maybe even more dangerous than communism. A few years later, in 1982, working through Jordan, the CIA would arm the Muslim Brothers in Syria and try to move against the Syrian secular pro-Soviet regime. There, Assad responded by massacring Sunnis in Hama by the tens of thousands. It was a confusing time. What was happening in Afghanistan was a revolution led by these progressive communists who were going to move Afghanistan forward 500 years in 5 months. They were enormously unpopular. They met resistance from every front. They tried to, by force, introduce educational policies, vaccination policies, and all kinds of other policies that were deeply resisted by a traditional society. And the Soviet response was to tell them to slow down, figure out a way to become legitimate. The code words the Soviet Union used endlessly was national reconciliation. The first president, this Taraki that Alam mentioned, was reasonably sensible on this front, but his vice president, Hafizullah Amin, was really a go-getter. The Soviet Union asked Taraki to throw Hafizullah Amin out in the summer of 1979 so that they could slow this process down and figure out a way to build support for this socialist project they were going to sort of, I don't know, help in Afghanistan. The result was Hafizullah Amin murdered Taraki, assassinated him in September of 1979, and basically gave the Soviet Union, up yours, we're going to do it my way. 3 months later, the Soviet Union invaded and killed Hafizullah Amin and took over the country. and installed a regime that stayed in power until 1986. And that Baba Kamal, they also told, go slower. National reconciliation. For 6 years, all we heard about was national reconciliation, trying to reach out and build broad, legitimate government. Make your government popular. It's just deja vu all over again when I listen to the American position with the regime in Kabul today. The Soviet Union gave up on that project in 1986. Gorbachev said this was a fool's quest. Kamal was never going to make it. They ousted him and put in a guy named Najibullah, who was supposed to do more of the same, but at least he was a new face. But he had been the former Secretary General of the COD, essentially the Afghan KGB, not exactly your nice and warm and fuzzy type. And he didn't have a whole lot of more success. And he stayed in power, however, even after the Soviet Union left Afghanistan. They were out by 1989, and then there was civil war in Afghanistan until 1991, 92. Najibullah stayed in power for those 3 years. He had heavy Soviet support, even though the Russians were out. And he was ousted essentially in 1992 as an alliance was made between Pakistan and the Northern Alliance, led by Ahmad Massoud, coming out of minority communities in Afghanistan, especially the Tajiks and the Uzbeks. And they took over, and later on, when the United States invaded, we would ally again with Massoud and the Northern Alliance and take over the country from the north. If you don't know, Afghanistan's north is Uzbek and Tajik, and its south is Pashtun. And one of the problems we've faced ever since that the Taliban's support is mostly among the Pashtun, and there's an ethnic dimension to this problem in Afghanistan that neither the Soviet Union nor the United States has been able to figure out. But let me give you a couple takeaway points as I look back on that Afghan experience for the Russians. The Soviet Union did not stand aside when asked for help. They saw merit in the progressive movement of the PDPA, People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. They got themselves in, down that sliding board. It could not control its client. It could not slow them down. It could not make them do what it wanted. And it could not make them legitimate in the eyes of most Afghans. The Soviet Union told them to, just like we're telling the government in Kabul, make yourself popular. Reach out. Somehow get a national reconciliation process going. It was as hopeless then as it seems to be now. There was a very poor feeling in Moscow for what was going on. They didn't understand the ethnic and various complex sides to the Afghan political conflict. It was never a two-sided activity here. It was never an us against them, communists against somebody else. It was much more complicated than that. They were never able to get first Taraki, then Amin, then Kamal or Najibullah to put an effective plan for national reconciliation into place. Maybe that was impossible because Afghanistan's traditional history is one of highly decentralized governance, and everything both the Russians and we have done since then is try to make that a more centralized approach to governance. Okay, and the Afghan the actions of Pakistan and the United States made it very difficult for the government backed by the Soviet Union to get a grip on what was going on, because we had an endless pipeline of weapons and supply into Afghanistan due to the Americans. Now, like Afghanistan, the initial push for change in Syria came from inside the country. It was very much connected to the Arab Spring. It was a desire to be done with an authoritarian, technocratic, and corrupt oligarchy that runs Syria, the regime of the Assads. It's similar in that regard to what happened in Egypt, and Tunisia, and Bahrain, and Jordan, and Yemen, and Libya. And in all these places, the conservative, usually technocratic military regimes pushed back. And successfully in everywhere but Tunisia and Libya. And the jury is still out in Syria and Yemen. Russia was not involved, nor was it quick to get involved. There was a lot of intervention, however. Turkey and Saudi Arabia were in deeply early on, as Amir said. So was Qatar. Qatar was backing Muslim Brothers and al-Nusra, as we mentioned earlier. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which had competed with Qatar and Libya, were up to their eyeballs backing other groups. And then it became, and I still think it is, a proxy war on the Sunni side between Qatar and the Muslim Brothers versus Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabi. Lots of weapons, lots of money pouring in. The Muslim Brothers originally aligned with Turkey. Erdogan was very supportive of them in Egypt when they took power briefly, just a few years ago. Of course, the military regime in Egypt was having none of that, and after 11 months ousted the Muslim Brother government in Egypt, and its position in Syria started to weaken very quickly as well. But originally Erdogan, I think, had seen himself as the new model for a democratically oriented, religiously legitimate governance in the Arab world, and Turkey would be the model for how this would work, because at the time Erdogan was seen as a very popular presidential figure in Turkey who was also deeply religious. And he was keen to export that to Syria. He played a big role early on in the civil war. And the civil war was fueled by not just Turkish, but even more so Saudi Arabian, Qatari weapons and money. And the U.S. stayed out, wisely in my view, because there were no credible leaders that had a mass base that could win. The liberals and progressives, and there were plenty, and I've met some of them. Amir, of course, knows them very well. But the problem is they have very little public support, and they would be unlikely to come to power, even though they would hope the United States would help them come to power. Their ability to stay there would be very limited. And that's because so much of the country in Syria is Sunni. And it's being courted by Saudi Arabia on the one hand and the Muslim Brothers through Qatar and Turkey on the other. And those groups are far more popular than any alternative I've seen among the liberal crowd is. And unlike in Afghanistan, in Syria there is a large, urban, more secular, highly educated community. The problem is they see a takeover by the Muslim Brothers or ISIS or any other Islamic group as an absolutely anathema. And I think they've made their decision the last 5 or 6 years. Their best bet to avoid that very dark future is to stick with Assad. And that has given Assad a base of support that many in the West, particularly President Obama, I don't think expected. I think they thought he would just fall right down, because who the heck would support him? Well, who would support him, of course, are all the Alawites, the Christians, and many secular Muslims who are urban dwellers who are terrified by what they might get if Qatar or Saudi Arabia win in this proxy war. And that's made it very difficult for liberal oppositionists in Iraq to make a very credible case, in Syria, to make a credible case that they're a real alternative. They're a real alternative that will lead you, just as they did in Egypt, to nowhere. In the Egyptian election, the liberal secular types got 14% of the vote. The conservative religious people won 75% of the vote. So let me just finish. The civil war is fueled by these outside forces. What we know about civil wars is when they're heavily fueled by outside forces, they're very hard to stop, because Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, or Iran, they can fight to the last Syrian. They don't feel the pain of this, and they will continue to let the Syrians fight for a very long time, I'm afraid. The Russians came in, as I said, in 4 years after this war started, in the late fall or early fall of 2015. For just the reasons he said, Assad was collapsing. It's deja vu. In Afghanistan started to collapse. They came in to keep it together. The Russians are afraid of American expansion, and they're afraid of Islamic fundamentalism. Not only in Chechnya, but 15% of the Russian population is Muslim. Putin is obsessed with not allowing radical Islamists. In fact, Russian policy on this has been much more consistent than the Americans. Where we were in bed with the Mujahideen and for the Muslim Brothers for a while, the Russian position has been pretty harsh on Islamic fundamentalism straight out, and just brutal in Chechnya. And I think that it's been that way in Syria as well. Let me just finish by saying, I don't think Syria is likely to become a Russian client state. It never was. Arab socialism and Arab nationalism have deep roots in Syria. Michel Aflaq and other Syrian leaders who were socialists were never Moscow's puppets. At the height of everything I've been describing in 1979, when the Soviet Union was aligned with Iraq against Iran in this Iran-Iraq war, Syria didn't go with the Soviet Union. Hafez al-Assad aligned with Iran. And I think what would happen now is that when this starts to get more stable, Moscow will push very hard on Assad to reach out and try to build national reconciliation in the 2017 version. Assad will be absolutely unable to do that. He has no chance. The weapons will pour into his opponents on all sides to make it just, they'll never settle, I don't think. I think the Russians are perfectly willing to dump Assad, just like they dumped Amin and they dumped Karmal. If you could promise them a secular, progressively oriented somebody who will align the urban Sunni and not let this country go the way of the Wahhabi, they'll be okay, they'll be open-minded to that. They've already signaled that. They're not wedded to Assad, but they are absolutely opposed to allowing Syria to go the way of Iraq into endless civil war. And the last point I would make, I had a chance a few years ago to get an earful from the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and I've heard it now. That was live and in person, but I've heard it plenty of times since. I think the Russian view at the top, including by Putin, is that the Americans have made a horrible mess of the Middle East. That we have destroyed Iraq. And we were on our way to destroying much of the whole Middle East, and they stepped in to try to salvage what they could and stabilize it, as Amir said. But they're not much interested in hearing about American lecturing, given our history in Iraq.